it was undone, there's only $7 in the bank account. But I made a decision because there was $1,000 there. Whoops! I better not commit because I made a decision based on a fantasy. So if I'm using a value that never really was there, I can't commit either because I'm building on a fantasy. Again, I would refer to Cloud Cuckoo Land, which refers to a play by Aristophanes. But, I mean, again, I can't talk about clouds anymore because clouds are real. It's a fantasy I'm building. Okay? So there's something called cascading rollbacks. Not cascading deletes, cascading rollbacks. And what's a cascading rollback? Well, here you have T1, T2, we have a schedule with T1 and T2. T1, read A, wrote A, all very nice. T2, read A, it read the value that T1 wrote, and it's going to be writing a value of A. And now, T1 rolls back. Can T2 commit? How many think T2 can commit? How many think T2 can't commit? How many don't want to commit? Well, then we'll have to roll back. The transaction can't commit. It depends on something that isn't there. Even just reading it, whether or not it wrote it, it can't commit. So there's this notion of if T1 rolled back and T2 depends on values that were read from T1, it has to roll back also. So that's a cascading rollback. T2 depends on T1, T1 rolled back, T2 has to roll back. Okay, so the commit of T2 would mean that there would be no way that we could undo it. If we committed T2, I mean, T2 had this commit there. It was before T1 undid itself. If we allow T2 to commit, how do we undo it? It's happened, it's there. T3 could have read what T2 wrote. There could be some other actions that are going on outside the database. Undoing it, yeah, we could try to play apology games, but undoing it is not really possible. So there's this notion of what's called a recoverable. Sorry, lots of terminology here. It's what's called a recoverable schedule, but the terminology says what it says. It means what it says. You can only have commits after transactions that you depend on have also committed. You can't commit T2 if a transaction that it depends on has not committed. What do I mean by depends on? It read dirty data from that transaction. Well, that dirty data might not really be dirty. It might be committed. And by the way, I'll tell you a little subtlety there. If T2 reads data from T1, and T1 ends up committing, is T2 okay? Not necessarily. Here's the subtlety. T1 might change the data again. T1 might write A again before it commits. So suppose A is not allowed to be odd. T1 added 1 to A, but it figures it's okay, I'm going to add 3 to it later, but I'm temporarily adding 1 to it. But I have to decide, do I want to add 3 or 5 to it? Right? T2 read the value when the 1 got added and the thing was odd. So it may have read an intermediate value where T1 is going to change it further. So it's not good enough for the transaction to have committed. You have to have read the value that it wrote, final value that it wrote inside, final answer, who wants to be a committed transaction. You need final answers for the thing to be able to work. So if you commit only after all transactions that supply dirty data have committed, you better make sure that you've read the last value that it wrote. It's a little bit of this extra subtlety there. So basically, if you have, notice the not so subtle thing that happened over there on the red transaction on the left. Before we had the rollback, we committed blue, which is T2, before we knew whether or not T1 committed. But now we're switching to having the commit happen in T1, and we have T2 waiting until it knows that T1 commits. So you can only commit after you know everything you depend on has committed, and the value you read was the last value that you wrote.
Question?
Yeah.
So what's the difference between doing this and just packaging all those transactions into just one giant transactions?
Because one of them might roll back and the other one might not.
Right, but, so, cause in this case, right, you said, if T1 rolls back, then obviously T2 would have to roll back.
Yeah, but it's conceivable that you wanna decide to roll back one of them versus the other. You wanna be able to allow one of them to roll back without requiring that the other one, roll back. You'd like to be able to maybe have, if they don't interfere, you'd like to make sure that T2 can commit because there is no problem between them. So you could always go ahead and package 5 transactions in one transaction, but then you're making their fates all depend on each other, which may not necessarily be true. If I'm trying to reserve an airplane seat, yeah, I could combine that together with your reserving an airplane seat, but I might be reserving a totally different seat, and not a big issue involved. And you might be taking 5 minutes to make a decision about which seat you want. I don't want to have to package things together unnecessarily. It is a technique that can work. There are some advantages to it, but as you've seen, there are some serious disadvantages as well. So there is this term, used to be called ACA, now it's called ACR. Used to be avoid cascading aborts, now it's avoid cascading rollbacks. There's a property that you'd like to be able to have schedules where you know that you're going to avoid any cascading problem. How do you avoid cascade? How do you have ACR? Basically, you make sure that a transaction only reads committed data. That will ensure that the data that it reads can't go away. It also ensures that it has the last value that the transaction read. So you only read committed data. You read commit. You only read committed data. That will ensure that there can never be any cascading rollbacks. But you see the disadvantage of that? T1 wrote something. You want to be able to read it. Do you read the value before T1, or do you read the value that T1 wrote? If you read the value that T1 wrote, you've got a problem because T1 hasn't committed yet. If you read the data before T1, then you're saying, well, I'm supposed to be happening before T1, but there could be a problem with you happening before T1 because maybe T1 did the reverse with you, and T1 has to happen after you. You have a problem if T1 has to happen both before and after you because you can't do it. There are conflicts in both directions. Again, we'll see examples of how that works further. So basically, when you have a transaction that only reads committed data, ACR can't happen. Sorry, CR, cascading rollbacks can't happen. You're avoiding cascading rollbacks. So let me say that again. If you only read committed data, you have an ACR schedule. If every transaction in that schedule only reads committed data, everything is cool. Okay, so that all ends up being good. You don't have the cascading rollback problem. And that will then mean that the schedule is recoverable. Just to remind you, let's just go back. If you have ACR, then it must be recoverable. What did recoverable end up meaning? Let's see, where was that one? Let's see. Serializable schedule, cascading rollbacks, where was recoverable? Oh, there it is. You commit only after the transactions that supply dirty data have committed. So recoverable says you commit only after all the transactions that supply dirty data have committed, which means that you're going to be able to, well, it's on the same slide, so that's why I didn't find it, I changed. So if you follow the ACR policy and you only read committed data, then it will always be a recoverable schedule. It's right there. So that's kind of a nice policy to be able to have, ACR. One of the techniques, a very commonly used one, again, this and optimistic are the most commonly used ones, but there are other approaches. For CC, C stands for concurrency control, so you're going to see CC a lot. Okay, not speaking Spanish, it's concurrency control. It's a technique for concurrency control, and it basically ensures that you only see data from committed transactions. But it's also called pessimistic concurrency control, because it means you gotta wait to find out, did the data get committed or not? And here's the way that it works. You have a lock manager. And the lock manager is gonna store triples. And the triples are gonna consist of a transaction ID, XID. The ID of every transaction has a unique identifier. That's a unique identifier for the transaction. 64 bits, it's easy to have unique identifiers. You just roll through 64 bits. Used to be 32 bits. People typically now can use 64 bits, okay? There are other games that can be played. There's an RID. What's an RID? Same thing it's always been. It's a record ID. You're locking tuples. We're only talking here about locking tuples. So you're gonna lock a tuple. So this transaction has locked the tuple. And then there's a mode. And for now, we'll get to other modes later. For now, there are going to be two modes, which you can think of as being read and write, but the terminology that's used is shared and exclusive, S and X. So when you're reading data, that's okay with me. For lots of other people to read the data, I don't have any problem. Share and share alike, it's a shared lock. Okay. But what about exclusive mode? I'm writing the data. You know what? If I'm writing the data, nobody else can read it because until I commit and my exclusive lock is released, they don't know whether or not I'm going to actually commit or not. So when I'm in S mode, I'll let a lot of S's go on. I can have as many people reading as I want. When I'm in X mode, do I allow anybody else in X mode? Nope. X and X are incompatible. What about S and X? Are those modes compatible? Can one person read while another person's in exclusive mode? S and X are not compatible. Similarly, X and S are not compatible. If somebody has an X lock, I can't go ahead and read it because I don't know whether or not they're committed. And if I'm reading it, then there's a problem with respect to X mode because they might write it, and then when I read it again, I see the new value they wrote. S and then X, and then I read it again, not compatible. So we are entering the matrix. There it is. The dash dash means no lock at all. The S mode means shared, which again is for reads. The X is exclusive, which is for writes. And the checks mean, sure, grab the lock. Grab some bagels, grab some locks, some cream cheese if you want. S and S are fine. S and nothing is fine. As many S's as you want. But S and X, X and S, X and X, nope. What does a transaction do if it can't get a lock? Well, there's a question.
Yeah, so you're trying to stop the users from reading stale data in this case? Or?
I'm trying to stop users from reading data that hasn't committed.
Okay.
Because then I'll have cascading rollback.
I see.
If I read data from a fantasy, I'm reading data that might never happen, and I'm not going to be able to commit. So there are issues involved in that. So if a transaction can't get a lock, what can it do? Well, one of the things that it can do is it can suspend on a wait queue, which basically says that I'm going to wait until that lock becomes free. And there's a queue of people who are waiting, and as soon as the lock becomes free, I can go ahead and go. And that's, very nice. And when are my locks going to be acquired? You know what? Remember our friend Buffer Manager? There's a page that I need that has this data on it. I want to make sure that that page is around. When I do the Buffer Manager call, this is again classical stuff that's existed. When I have main memory database with everything in main memory, life has changed a little bit, but it still relates to this kind of concept. When I'm saying I want the page on which this data is to be there, I know the RID, I know what page it is. I want to lock this RID. Remember, this is a lower level component of the system where the RID is there for the data that I want to be able to access or write or whatever it is. So I've got the RID, I know what page it's on, I want to make sure the page is around. When I do the Buffer Manager call, I acquire the lock, or I may have to wait. We will talk later about another technique for dealing with somebody else holding a lock that you want. Question?
What if you have a circular dependency?
We'll get to that.
Okay.
Short answer, it's called deadlock, and we'll talk about how deadlocks can get detected and prevented and dealt with later. But great question. I want to ask you a different question. Suppose that I've got a shared lock. He wants an exclusive lock. You want to write. He comes in and he wants a shared lock. Can he get the shared lock? Sure, the shared lock and my shared lock are compatible, but he came in first and he wanted an X lock. Do I give him the shared lock? Maybe. He comes in, he wants a shared lock. Do I give him the shared lock? Maybe. I finish my transaction. He still can't get the X lock because these two guys have shared locks. He finishes. He comes in, he wants a shared lock. I give him a shared lock. He finishes. He's got an X lock. He's still in queue. He can't get his X lock. Infinite overtaking. You have the problem. You would say, well, shared locks are compatible. Just give everybody a shared lock. It's all perfectly compatible. No need to wait on a queue. The trouble is that he never gets his X lock because there are all these guys who want to read it that end up coming in. So you have to be very careful about your policies. Even though the S locks are compatible with each other, the infinite overtaking could lead to his starving. Not a good thing. Sorry, don't want you to starve. And now, in the brief 4 minutes, I'll start talking about two-phase locking. Next time we'll talk about strict two-phase locking. What does two-phase locking want? If a transaction wants to read or modify an object, it gets the appropriate lock. It gets the S lock for read, and it gets a X lock for modify, for write. Okay? And here's what two-phase locking means. Two-phase locking says, if you release a lock, you can never, as part of that same transaction, get another lock. Let me say this again. Two-phase locking means that you're climbing a hill. You're getting locks and locks and locks and locks, and you're getting more and more locks. Some may be read, some may be write, that is S and X. And then as soon as you release what's called the lock point, as soon as you release your first lock, you can take your time releasing the other locks. But you can never grab any more locks. This will guarantee serializability. It will guarantee that if all the transactions follow 2PL, if your locking policy in your lock manager is 2PL, you can never end up having a problem because anybody who basically runs after you start releasing locks comes after you. Okay? Anybody who grabs a lock after you've released it, they can come after you. They can grab the lock. The first thing you release is the lock on A. You're going to take your time on releasing B and C. But anybody who grabs the lock on A can come after you in a serial schedule. Because you're not grabbing any more locks. They can come after you. It's not going to be a problem. Anybody who comes after you release the first lock, they can come after you because they'll be reading the data that you've released, assuming that you ended up, committing. It guarantees that you have serializability, but there's something else that it doesn't guarantee. And I guess I will quickly tell you what strict 2PL is. Strict 2PL, which is stricter than 2PL, hence the name, says you hold all your locks until the transaction commits or rolls back. And then you release all of your locks after your transaction has made its decision, commit or roll back. With 2PL, you can release locks a little bit at a time. The transaction still can be going, but you haven't decided to commit or roll back, and there may be more logic that you're doing and so on, but you're not going to grab any more locks. I might be changing B again even after I've released the lock on A. But with strict 2PL, you hold all your locks until the transaction ends one way or the other, and then you release all the locks. And that, because it implies it implies 2PL. Strict 2PL implies 2PL. It's, it's just, the lock point gets moved to the end of the transaction. So strict 2PL looks like this. Whenever the lock point happens, you release all the locks, all of them. The lock point is no more work going on in the transaction. So you get serializability, but you get another property which is also extremely important. You get the ACR policy. With 2PL, you don't necessarily avoid cascading cascading rollback. Because you release the lock on A, but you might not commit. You haven't committed yet. So with 2PL, you release the lock on A, you still have locks on B and C, you haven't committed or rolled back. You're saying, okay, A, somebody else can lock it, somebody else can read it, but you still might roll back. With strict 2PL, the decision's been made. You either changed the data or you didn't change the data. Everything you've done is finished. And at that point, you not only have the serializability, which 2PL guarantees, but you also have this nice ACR policy. Okay? And as we said, ACR schedules are always recoverable. And speaking of recovery, I'm going to have to continue giving back midterms in my other class. Is there anybody who hasn't picked up the midterm from here? Still have a couple of exams for people. Okay? Then I don't have to take off the microphone because I didn't have it working. We will go